For a long time, Netflix looked untouchable. It was the rare company that didn't just disrupt one industry but quietly dismantled several at once, first altering how people rented movies, then how they paid for them, then how they watched them, and finally, how those movies and shows were even made in the first place. At its peak, Netflix wasn't just winning awards and dominating viewership, it was rewriting the rules of entertainment so completely that traditional cinema, cable television, and even rival tech companies were forced to react to its every move. The company was spending billions of dollars on content each year, and Reed Hastings made it clear that this number was not a ceiling but a starting point, openly stating that Netflix planned to keep increasing its spending on original programming rather than pulling back. The logic was simple and terrifying for competitors. Netflix wasn't just competing for attention, it was trying to own it. That strategy paid off in ways few companies ever experience. Netflix became the first streaming platform to receive an Oscar nomination for one of its original films, a symbolic moment that signaled to Hollywood that this was no longer a tech company dabbling in entertainment, but a studio in its own right. Viewership habits followed. Fewer people went to the cinema. Fewer people watched network television. Entire evenings, entire weekends, and eventually entire social conversations revolved around what people were watching on Netflix. In many ways, the story could have ended there, with a simple conclusion that Netflix won, the old guard lost, and the future belonged to streaming. But that would ignore how Netflix actually got there, and more importantly, why that dominance was never as permanent as it appeared. One of Netflix's greatest advantages wasn't just its content budget or its global reach, but its data. Unlike traditional television networks that relied on rating samples and delayed feedback, Netflix knew exactly what its users were watching, when they paused, when they stopped, when they binged, and when they abandoned a show entirely. That information fed directly into decisions about what types of shows to commission, which ones to renew, and which ones to quietly cancel. It wasn't guesswork. It was behavioral analysis at scale. At the same time, Netflix operated in nearly every country in the world, which meant that a successful show in one region could instantly become a global phenomenon. A series produced for a local audience could explode internationally without the friction that traditional distribution models imposed. Squid Game was the most visible example of this effect, a Korean show that became one of the most watched series in Netflix's history, but it wasn't an isolated case. Reed Hastings himself pointed out that shows originating in smaller markets often performed many times better outside their home country than within it, revealing just how powerful Netflix's global distribution had become. What makes Netflix's story even more remarkable is how many times the company has fundamentally reinvented itself. This wasn't a startup that stumbled onto success and rode a single idea into the sunset. Netflix began by selling and renting DVDs by mail, then shifted to a subscription model, then pivoted again into on-demand streaming, and finally transformed into a full-scale content production company. It's easy to forget that Netflix is older than Google, and that its longevity comes not from stubbornly defending one business model, but from repeatedly abandoning models that were working in favor of ones that would work better in the future. The concept of binge-watching, now so normal it barely registers, was effectively normalized by Netflix's decision to release entire seasons at once, reshaping how stories were written and consumed. Behind all of this sat a company culture that was just as unconventional as its business strategy. From the moment employees joined Netflix, they were exposed to a philosophy that rejected comfort and stability in favor of performance and responsibility. One of the first things new hires learned was a sentence that would be unthinkable in most corporate onboarding presentations. Adequate performance gets a generous severance package. The message was clear. Being average was not enough, and staying employed at Netflix meant continuously earning your place. Reed Hastings believed deeply in the idea of talent density, the notion that a small group of exceptional people consistently outperforms a larger group diluted by mediocrity. Research supported this view, showing that even a single underperforming team member could drag down a group's output by as much as 40%, while teams composed entirely of high performers elevated each other's results. Netflix took this belief to its logical extreme. The company embraced what it called the rockstar principle, arguing that top talent doesn't outperform average employees by a small margin, but by orders of magnitude. One exceptional employee, in Netflix's view, could deliver the impact of 10 or even 100 merely competent ones. That belief justified paying top-of-market salaries and keeping teams lean, prioritizing quality over headcount. To enforce this, Netflix implemented the keeper test, asking managers a simple but brutal question. If this person were leaving for another company, would you fight to keep them? If the answer was no, the employee was encouraged to leave with a generous severance package, often 4 to 6 months of pay, regardless of tenure. This culture of high expectations enabled something else Netflix valued just as much: freedom. With fewer employees and higher trust, Netflix eliminated many of the rules that bogged down large organizations. There was no formal vacation policy, no rigid expense approval process, and no micromanagement of how people did their jobs. Employees were expected to act in Netflix's best interests, and in return, they were given unprecedented autonomy. Information flowed freely as well. Netflix shared internal plans and financial data with all employees, even junior ones, a level of transparency that would terrify most executives. This radical openness extended to feedback, where honesty was not just encouraged but required, even when it meant criticizing managers or Reed Hastings himself. Of course, this approach wasn't without consequences. Unlimited freedom sometimes led to abuse. Radical honesty sometimes crossed into hostility. High-performance expectations created pressure, and pressure created fear. Former employees described an environment where the stakes were always high, where security was temporary, and where mistakes were tolerated only if they came from bold experimentation rather than complacency. Netflix accepted these trade-offs because Hastings believed the greatest risk wasn't making the wrong decision, but failing to adapt quickly enough. In his mind, the lesson of Blockbuster loomed large, a reminder that success today means nothing if it blinds you to tomorrow. For a long time, that philosophy seemed flawless, but the conditions that allowed Netflix to dominate began to change, and when they did, the cracks became harder to ignore. The shift didn't happen overnight, and that's what made it so dangerous. Netflix didn't collapse, it stalled. And in business, stalling after years of momentum can be just as alarming as failure. The very success that allowed Netflix to define the streaming era also taught its competitors exactly how to fight back. Every major media company watched Netflix prove that direct-to-consumer streaming worked, and almost all of them reached the same conclusion. If streaming was the future, then giving Netflix access to their best content was a mistake. One by one, companies that had once been content suppliers became direct rivals. Disney pulled its catalog to launch Disney+. Warner Brothers reclaimed its shows for HBO Max. NBC Universal took The Office for Peacock. What once made Netflix feel endless suddenly felt thinner. Not because Netflix wanted less content, but because the industry had decided to fracture itself. This fragmentation changed the economics overnight. In Netflix's early streaming years, licensing content was relatively cheap. Studios were skeptical of streaming, and Netflix benefited from that hesitation. But once streaming became the primary battleground, licensing costs soared, and in many cases, licenses simply disappeared. Netflix was forced to double down on original content not as a strategy for differentiation, but as a matter of survival. Spending tens of billions of dollars a year on originals was no longer an optional growth lever. It was the price of staying relevant. For a while, this worked. Netflix released an overwhelming volume of content, ensuring there was always something new, something trending, something to keep subscribers from canceling. Then growth slowed. In 2022, Netflix announced something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. It lost subscribers. Not gained fewer than expected, but lost them outright. For the first time in over a decade, the narrative broke. Investors panicked. The stock imploded, shedding tens of billions of dollars in market value in a matter of days. Headlines declared the end of Netflix, Analysts rushed to assign blame, and suddenly the same company that once defined inevitability was being discussed as vulnerable. Some of that reaction was overblown. Netflix suspended service in Russia due to the war in Ukraine, instantly losing hundreds of thousands of subscribers. The pandemic had artificially inflated subscriber numbers as people stayed home, and a post-pandemic correction was inevitable. Inflation squeezed household budgets, and streaming subscriptions became easier to cut than essentials. Even after the decline, Netflix still had more subscribers than it did before the pandemic, and remained the largest streaming service in the world by a wide margin. But perception matters, and the perception had shifted from unstoppable growth to uncertain future. Faced with slowing momentum, Netflix began to consider changes that would have once felt unthinkable. Password sharing, something the company had openly encouraged in its growth phase, was suddenly framed as a problem to be solved. Prices rose again, testing subscriber patience. Discussions of an ad-supported tier emerged, a symbolic break from Netflix's long-standing identity as a premium, interruption-free service. None of these moves came from greed in isolation. They were reactions to a harsher environment where content costs kept rising, while subscriber growth no longer covered them effortlessly. Still, from the user's perspective, the value proposition felt worse. Less familiar content, higher prices, more restrictions, and the looming possibility of ads. At the same time, Netflix faced criticism over the quality and consistency of its originals. The company's data-driven approach allowed it to greenlight projects at scale, but scale came with trade-offs. Some shows felt disposable, designed to spike briefly before vanishing from cultural memory. Others were canceled abruptly, leaving audiences hesitant to invest emotionally in new series for fear they'd never see a proper ending. Competitors like Disney had decades of beloved intellectual property to lean on, while Netflix had to manufacture cultural moments continuously, an exhausting and expensive requirement. Internally, Netflix also faced tension. Employees protested certain content. Management responded bluntly, reinforcing the idea that Netflix was not a family, but a team, and that those who felt misaligned with its creative direction were free to leave. This response was consistent with Netflix's philosophy, but it also highlighted the emotional cost of operating at this intensity. A culture optimized for performance and speed does not prioritize comfort, and as Netflix matured, that reality became harder to ignore. Yet focusing only on streaming rivals misses a deeper issue. Netflix's true competition is not just other streaming platforms, but attention itself. Reed Hastings has said openly that Netflix competes with everything that consumes leisure time, including video games. Fortnite is not a joke competitor. It captures hours, habits, and emotional investment. TikTok presents an even more direct challenge. While Netflix spends billions producing content, TikTok's users generate content for free. Its algorithm is relentlessly effective, its commitment frictionless, and its time cost minimal. You don't choose what to watch on TikTok, it chooses for you. You don't commit to an hour, you commit to seconds, and those seconds compound into hours before you realize what happened. YouTube represents another existential comparison. When a YouTube creator can generate more views reacting to a Netflix show than the show itself receives, it raises uncomfortable questions about where cultural power truly lives. Netflix pays for every minute of its content. YouTube pays nothing for most of what fills its platform. Both compete for the same finite resource, time. This reframes the entire problem. Netflix is not losing because it forgot how to stream. It's struggling because the battle has expanded beyond streaming entirely. The attention economy has widened, and Netflix is fighting companies with fundamentally different cost structures, incentives, and feedback loops. In that context, Netflix's challenge is not just about content quality or pricing strategy, but about relevance in a world where entertainment is shorter, faster, more personalized, and endlessly abundant. Still, declaring the end of Netflix is premature. This is a company that has reinvented itself multiple times, often before it was forced to. It remains the global leader in streaming, operates at a scale few competitors can match, and continues to influence how stories are told worldwide. The streaming market itself is still growing, with vast portions of the global population yet to fully come online. Netflix may own a smaller slice of the pie than before, but the pie continues to expand. What is clear, however, is that the golden age of effortless dominance is over. The era where Netflix could grow simply by existing has passed. The next phase will demand sharper choices, fewer mistakes, and perhaps a willingness to redefine itself yet again. Whether Netflix can do that remains uncertain, but if history has shown anything, it's that Netflix's greatest strength has never been any single product or strategy. It has been the refusal to stand still. If Netflix fails to adapt this time, the irony will be difficult to ignore. A company that once disrupted Blockbuster could find itself referenced in the same cautionary breath. But if it succeeds, if it pivots once more and finds a new equilibrium in the attention economy, then this chapter will simply become another example of why betting against Netflix has rarely paid off. Either way, the story isn't over. And in an industry built on narratives, that may be the most important thing of all.